This is the story of Sarah Hartsfield, a woman who killed her husband with a fatal dose of insulin and nearly got away with it. It's a story of love turned lethal, of secrets buried under charm, and of a past so dark that even death itself seemed to follow her from one relationship to the next. By the time police uncovered what really happened inside that quiet Texas home, 5 marriages had already come and gone. One fiancé was dead. A husband lay in a coma. And everyone who had ever loved Sarah Hartsfield seemed to meet the same chilling fate: betrayal, fear, or death. But to understand how it all came to this, we need to start on a cold January afternoon in 2023, the day Joseph Hartsfield stopped breathing. The 911 call came just after 3 p.m. Sarah's voice trembled as she told dispatchers her husband was unresponsive. "He's not breathing right. He's diabetic," she said, panic laced through her words. When paramedics arrived, they found 46-year-old Joseph lying motionless on the bed. His skin was pale, clammy to the touch. His blood sugar levels were critically low, the kind of hypoglycemia that doesn't happen by accident. Sarah told them she'd been asleep after surgery, recovering from pain medication, unaware that anything was wrong until she woke up and found him that way. She claimed she called for help as soon as she realized something was wrong. But what responders saw didn't line up with panic or urgency. The scene looked oddly staged. The insulin pens placed neatly beside the bed, the house unnaturally quiet, and Sarah calm enough to answer every question without hesitation. At the hospital, doctors did everything they could. Joseph was unresponsive, slipping deeper into a coma. His blood sugar wouldn't stabilize. No matter how much glucose they gave him, his levels kept crashing. One nurse whispered to another that it almost seemed like someone was counteracting the treatment. By the time the toxicology reports came back, their worst fear was confirmed. Joseph had been poisoned with insulin. Too much insulin can shut down the body from the inside out, starving the brain of glucose, stopping the heart, and leaving almost no trace. It's quick, quiet, and devastatingly effective. For detectives, the signs were alarming. Sarah's husband was diabetic, yes. But the amount of insulin in his system wasn't the kind of overdose that happens by mistake. It was deliberate. Still, there was one problem. There was no direct proof that Sarah gave the injection. Sarah told police Joseph must have done it himself. Maybe he made a dosing error. Maybe it was an accident. Maybe, she suggested, he wanted to die. But Joseph's family didn't buy it for a second. His sister, Jeannie, told investigators that Joseph had been terrified of his wife in the weeks before his death. "He told me he was worried she'd kill him in his sleep," she said, her voice shaking in court later. Jeannie had begged him to leave. "I tried so hard to get him not to go back," she said through tears. But he always did. He loved Sarah, and like the men before him, he thought he could fix her. That decision would cost him his life. When detectives examined Joseph's phone, they made a disturbing discovery. Hours before the 911 call, messages had been sent from his phone to Sarah's. One showed a picture of his driver's license. Another, a photo of their wedding day. A third contained the login details for a new bank account, followed by a key code labeled Apple Legacy Contact. That code would allow Sarah to access all his phone data, in the event of his death. Investigators quickly realized something was wrong. "It is my opinion that she created the legacy contact info and sent it to her phone," Detective Skylar Roch later testified. When police analyzed Sarah's phone, the contradictions multiplied. She had told officers she was asleep for hours, heavily sedated on pain medication. But her phone data showed a different story. She had been active almost every hour that night, sending messages, making calls, and deleting texts. And then came the most chilling discovery: a missing video she had sent to her daughter around the time Joseph fell unconscious. Prosecutors said the clip showed Joseph gasping, struggling to breathe, roughly an hour and a half before she ever dialed 911. By the time the truth began to unfold, Sarah's carefully built facade was crumbling. But what truly stunned prosecutors was how familiar this story sounded. Because this wasn't the first time someone close to Sarah Hartsfield had ended up dead. 5 years earlier, in 2018, Sarah had been engaged to a man named David Bragg. Their relationship, much like her marriage to Joseph, was volatile, filled with arguments, threats, and sudden reconciliations. One night, David Bragg was shot dead. The bullet came from Sarah's gun. She told police it was self-defense, that he had attacked her, that she feared for her life. At the time, local authorities believed her. They ruled the shooting justified. Sarah walked free. But after Joseph's death, the case was reopened. A detective testified that certain details in Sarah's story from 2018 seemed odd and abnormal. She had claimed David lunged at her, but evidence suggested he was shot from a distance. No charges were filed, yet. But the shadow of that shooting loomed large over her new trial. And that wasn't the only ghost from her past. An FBI agent testified that Sarah had once asked her fourth husband to kill her third husband's new wife, a murder-for-hire plot that was never carried out, but whose chilling details resurfaced years later in court. There was also an alleged arson, a 2014 fire at a home in Missouri that her grandmother had given to her brother. Sarah denied involvement, but the flames had conveniently erased evidence of financial disputes within the family. One by one, prosecutors laid these pieces before the jury, a trail of destruction that followed Sarah across states, marriages, and years. Each relationship ended in chaos, violence, or tragedy. And each time, she had walked away untouched. Until now. Assistant District Attorney Mallory Vargas stood before the courtroom, her voice echoing through the silence. "What a wild coincidence," she said, "that no person can leave her without consequences." Sarah sat still, her expression unreadable, her blonde hair perfectly combed, her hands folded neatly on the defense table. To anyone watching, she looked calm. Too calm. Her lawyer, Case Darwin, countered fiercely. He said the state had no real evidence tying Sarah to her husband's death. "The state is like a magician," he told jurors. "We all like magic, it's cool, but magic is not real." He insisted Joseph's death was tragic but accidental. A diabetic episode gone wrong. A self-inflicted mistake, not a murder. But for those who knew Joseph, that argument was impossible to accept. They had heard the fear in his voice in those final weeks. The way he confided that Sarah watched him too closely. The way he joked, half seriously, that he might not live long enough to see their first anniversary. Behind closed doors, Joseph's life had become a nightmare. Friends said Sarah controlled everything, his phone, his bank accounts, even his insulin. She monitored his every move, questioned every text, and isolated him from his family. And when he finally told her he was leaving, she made sure he never got the chance. As the trial continued, more secrets spilled into the open. Detectives testified that Sarah had deleted large portions of her search history. When they recovered fragments of data, the contents sent chills down their spines. Late-night searches about insulin dosages, questions about how long it takes to die from hypoglycemia, inquiries about inheritance laws. The jury listened in silence as prosecutors described Joseph's final hours. How he slipped in and out of consciousness while Sarah stood by, watching. How she waited more than an hour before calling for help. How she texted her daughter a video of him struggling to breathe instead of dialing 911. When the verdict was finally read, Sarah's face barely changed. Guilty of first-degree murder. After just 1 hour of deliberation, the jury had reached a unanimous decision. But for the people who'd survived her, ex-husbands, children, relatives of past lovers, the verdict was more than justice. It was relief. Because to them, Sarah Hartsfield wasn't just a manipulative woman. She was a storm that destroyed everything in her path. Still, even now, questions linger. How did she manage to avoid suspicion for so long? Why did so many people believe her? And what really happened on those nights when no one was watching? As Sarah was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, reporters shouted her name. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. She just smiled faintly, as if she still had one more secret left to keep. But what the world didn't know yet was that Sarah's story wasn't over. Because deep within the reopened files of her past, in the death of David Bragg, the fire in Missouri, and the whispers of a murder plot, there were patterns too dark to ignore. And investigators were about to uncover something that would send shockwaves far beyond that Texas courtroom. Something that would make even her defenders wonder. Had Sarah Hartsfield been getting away with murder all along? The courtroom had emptied, but the echoes of her guilt still lingered. The air outside the Chambers County Courthouse was heavy, humid, dense, almost suffocating. Reporters whispered into cameras, their voices sharp and urgent. 50-year-old Sarah Hartsfield, now convicted of murdering her husband, sentenced to life in prison. Inside, Sarah was escorted away, wrists cuffed, chin high. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She looked composed, eerily so, like a woman who'd been through this before. And maybe, in her own way, she had. Because for Sarah Hartsfield, Joseph's death wasn't a single act of violence. It was the latest chapter in a long, disturbing pattern, one written in fear, manipulation, and blood. Investigators soon discovered that to understand the murder of Joseph Hartsfield, you had to go back nearly 3 decades, to the first man who thought he could love her. Sarah grew up in Missouri, a small-town girl with a quick smile and sharper instincts. Friends from her early years remembered her as charming but intense. She could make you feel like you were the only person in the world, one classmate said. And then the next day, it was like you never existed. That duality, warmth and coldness, would define every relationship she ever had. Her first marriage, in her early 20s, was short and chaotic. Police reports from the time showed frequent calls for domestic disturbances, but the stories always changed. Sometimes she was the victim, sometimes the aggressor. Her husband eventually left, telling a friend, "I don't know who she really is anymore." By her third marriage, the pattern was already forming. Control, isolation, chaos, followed by sudden reconciliation, then more violence. She had a way of making men orbit around her, feeding off their loyalty and guilt. But it was her engagement to David Bragg in 2018 that would foreshadow everything that came after. David was a kind man. Friends described him as patient, generous, the type who believed love could fix even the most broken person. Sarah had met him after another failed marriage, and at first, she was magnetic. She told him stories about betrayal, about being misunderstood. She painted herself as a survivor, and he believed her. But as months passed, David's friends began noticing changes. He withdrew from them. He seemed nervous when Sarah was around, glancing at her before answering questions. He told a close friend that she'd started tracking his phone, accusing him of cheating if he didn't respond within minutes. Then, on a cold night in February 2018, Sarah dialed 911. Her voice was panicked. "He came at me," she told dispatchers. "I had to shoot him." When officers arrived, they found David Bragg dead, a single bullet wound to the chest. Sarah was distraught, trembling, crying uncontrollably. She said he'd been violent, that she feared for her life. At first, the evidence seemed to support her. There were signs of a struggle and Sarah had a bruise on her arm. The local prosecutor ruled the shooting justified, case closed. But something about the scene nagged at detectives. Details that didn't quite add up. The distance of the shot, the trajectory of the bullet, the missing pieces of the story. Years later, when Sarah stood trial for killing Joseph Hartsfield, those same detectives would revisit the 2018 shooting. This time, the inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. One detective described it simply: her story was too perfect. As investigators dug deeper, more unsettling details surfaced. Before David Bragg's death, Sarah had been accused of plotting violence before, once asking a husband to kill another man's wife. It sounded like a rumor, until the FBI confirmed it. In 2014, Sarah's fourth husband told agents that she'd approached him with a horrifying request: to kill her ex-husband's new wife. She even described how it should be done. The FBI opened a file, but the plot never materialized, and no charges were filed. When asked about it later, Sarah denied everything. "People lie when they're bitter," she said. Still, that accusation would return years later, haunting the courtroom as prosecutors painted a picture of a woman for whom control was everything. And anyone who threatened that control ended up dead. And then, there was the fire. A decade earlier, back in Missouri, a family home had burned to the ground. The property had belonged to Sarah's grandmother, a modest house that she'd given to Sarah's brother. The blaze destroyed everything. Investigators suspected arson, but there was never enough evidence to charge anyone. Her brother claimed Sarah had been angry about the gift, that she believed the house should have been hers. She denied it, of course. "Why would I burn down my own family's home?" she said when questioned. But to those who knew her, it fit a pattern. When Sarah couldn't control something, or someone, she destroyed it. As the years went on, Sarah's relationships became a carousel of chaos. By her fifth marriage, the one to Joseph, her life was a labyrinth of half-truths and disappearances. Each man left behind a trail of fear, confusion, or tragedy. One of her former partners described her as a black hole in human form. Another said, she could be sweet one moment and terrifying the next. To the outside world, she presented as the perfect Southern wife, friendly, polite, always smiling. On social media, she posted photos of dinners, vacations, church events. But behind those curated snapshots, her private world was unraveling. By late 2022, her marriage to Joseph Hartsfield had become a war zone. They argued constantly. He confided in family that she'd been threatening him. "He told me he was scared," his sister Jeannie said. "He said she'd kill him if he tried to leave." And yet, he stayed. People often ask why victims of manipulation don't just walk away. The truth is, people like Sarah know how to trap their partners, emotionally, psychologically, financially. They blur the line between love and control until their victims can't tell the difference. For Joseph, that trap would be fatal. In the weeks before his death, Sarah convinced him to open a joint bank account. She pushed him to update his will. Then came the strange messages, the legacy contact, the photos of his ID, the wedding pictures sent to her phone. It was as if she were setting the stage for what was to come, and when Joseph's body finally gave out, everything was already in place. To the outside world, Sarah seemed like a grieving wife. But behind the scenes, investigators were connecting the dots and realizing just how many people had died or nearly died around her. The more they looked, the darker it became. A detective who had worked both the Bragg and Hartsfield cases described it best. Every time something bad happened, Sarah was the last person to see them alive, and the first to move on. But what terrified those investigators the most wasn't just her history. It was how ordinary she seemed. In court, prosecutors played the 911 recordings. They showed the text logs. They displayed photos from both crime scenes. Through it all, Sarah sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. When the nurse testified about seeing Joseph's blood sugar crash repeatedly, Sarah didn't flinch. To her defense attorney, it was composure. To everyone else, it was chilling. Psychologists who followed the case said Sarah's behavior fit the traits of a high-functioning sociopath. Intelligent, manipulative, emotionally detached. She could mimic empathy but never truly feel it. She could play the victim flawlessly, even when drenched in guilt. And for years, it worked. One investigator told reporters that Sarah reminded him of a spider. "She builds her web perfectly," he said. "You don't realize you're trapped until it's too late." By the time Joseph Hartsfield was buried, there was no escaping the pattern anymore. Every piece of her past pointed to one conclusion. Sarah Hartsfield didn't just kill her husband. She'd been perfecting the art of destruction for decades. But while the world focused on the sensational parts, the insulin, the trial, the life sentence, another story was quietly unfolding in the background. Because as detectives reopened old case files, as prosecutors revisited the shooting of David Bragg and the Missouri fire, something strange began to happen. People who had once defended Sarah started to change their stories. Friends who had sworn she was innocent began to remember things differently. One former friend came forward with a message Sarah had sent years earlier, a chilling, cryptic text that read, "Men think they're in control. They always forget who they're dealing with." And in that one line lay the truth about Sarah Hartsfield, a truth darker than anyone could have imagined. Because for Sarah, love wasn't companionship, it was ownership, and once you belonged to her, there was only one way out. But even as she sat behind bars, her story wasn't finished. There were still unanswered questions about David Bragg's death, about the mysterious fire, and about the men who barely escaped her grasp. And in those reopened case files, detectives would soon find something buried deep, a piece of evidence that could change everything they thought they knew about her. Something that would make even the most seasoned investigators wonder if Sarah Hartsfield's reign of control and terror had begun much earlier than anyone realized. When investigators reopened the files, they didn't expect to find much. Years had passed since David Bragg's death. The ex-fiancée Sarah claimed she shot in self-defense. But tucked inside an old evidence box was a letter David had written just weeks before he died. "If anything happens to me," it read, "it won't be an accident." Those words chilled detectives to the core. They began re-examining every detail: the trajectory of the bullet, Sarah's story, the position of his body. Nothing matched. He hadn't lunged at her. He'd been standing still, unaware, defenseless. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. Next, they revisited the suspicious house fire in Missouri. Back then, it was ruled undetermined. But new forensic tests showed traces of accelerant and a sizable insurance payout that landed in Sarah's bank account right after the fire. The pattern was undeniable. Every tragedy in her life came with profit, sympathy, or control. A man dies, and Sarah moves on richer or freer than before. Then came the discovery that sealed her fate: a deleted phone video, partially recovered from her cloud storage. It showed Joseph, gasping and convulsing in bed, and behind the camera, Sarah's voice, calm, detached, almost amused. She wasn't panicking. She was watching. To the jury, that moment erased all doubt. Sarah Hartsfield wasn't unlucky in love. She was lethal by design. Her conviction brought relief, but not peace. Families of her past victims described her as a woman who turned love into a weapon, control into a game. "She didn't kill out of rage," said David Bragg's sister. "She killed because she could." In prison, Sarah adjusted disturbingly well. Guards said she was charming, polite, always in control. Other inmates said she manipulated people even behind bars, turning them against each other like pieces on a board. A guard once caught her watching a documentary about her own trial. She smiled through the entire thing, proud, unbothered, as if she were the star of a story she'd written herself. Experts who studied her described her as intelligent, narcissistic, and calculating. A woman who could read people and twist their emotions until they broke. To Sarah, love wasn't connection. It was leverage. Now she sits in a Texas prison, serving life without parole. Her past continues to haunt investigators. The deaths, the fires, the chaos she left behind. Many believe there are more victims, more stories buried under years of manipulation and lies. But the truth, like Sarah herself, may never fully come to light. Because Sarah doesn't confess. She rewrites. She builds new versions of herself: the victim, the survivor, the misunderstood wife. Each mask crafted perfectly to the moment. Yet no mask lasts forever. Her downfall wasn't caused by evidence alone. It was caused by time. Time let her lies unravel. Let the victims' voices rise from silence. Let justice catch up to her. Now, behind concrete walls, Sarah Hartsfield lives out her final role. No longer the grieving widow or perfect wife, but the woman who thought she could outsmart death itself, and lost. And if her story teaches us anything, it's this: monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they sit across from you at the dinner table, smiling.